A woman stands motionless in a museum. For 736 hours, she does nothing but stare into the eyes of strangers. The art world calls it a masterpiece. The media calls it groundbreaking. But what if I told you that this was not art at all? What if this was a recruitment ritual, hidden in plain sight, designed to identify those whose minds could be broken and rebuilt? Her name is Marina Abramović. She is called the grandmother of performance art. She has been celebrated by presidents, billionaires, tech moguls, and Hollywood royalty. Lady Gaga calls her a spiritual guide. Jay-Z featured her in his music video. The Clintons attended her events. Microsoft built an advertising campaign around her face. But when we dig beneath the surface of her artistic practice, we find something far darker than paint on canvas or sculptures in galleries. We find instructions for blood rituals written in bodily fluids on walls. We find ceremonies that mirror ancient occult practices with disturbing precision. We find a guest list that reads like a who's who of global power brokers. And we find connections to individuals whose names appear in the darkest corners of recent history. This is not art criticism. This is an investigation. And by the end of this documentary, you will have to ask yourself a very uncomfortable question. Is Marina Abramović an artist who pushes boundaries? Or is she something else entirely? Is she a high priestess operating in plain sight, using the cover of contemporary art to conduct rituals that would horrify the general public if they understood what they were actually witnessing? The evidence we are about to present comes from leaked emails, published photographs, Abramović's own words in interviews, her written instructions, eyewitness accounts, and the exposed records of those who have attended her private gatherings. We will follow the money. We will decode the symbols, and we will name the names that the mainstream media refuses to mention when covering her work. But before we expose what happens at her events when the cameras stop rolling, we need to understand how Marina Abramović rose from an obscure Yugoslav performance artist to become the most celebrated figure in the contemporary art world. Because that origin story contains the first clues to understanding who she really is and who has been supporting her ascent for the past 5 decades. Marina Abramović was born in Belgrade, Yugoslavia, on November 30th, 1946. Her parents were Yugoslav partisans who fought alongside Tito's communist forces during World War II. Her mother, Danica Rosić, was a major in the Yugoslav People's Army and later became the director of the Museum of Art and Revolution in Belgrade. Her father, Vojin Abramović, was also a partisan fighter who received the status of national hero. From the very beginning, Marina was raised in an environment saturated with communist ideology, revolutionary violence, and the machinery of state propaganda. Her mother ran an institution dedicated to controlling how citizens perceived art and history. This is not an insignificant detail. The Museum of Art and Revolution was not a neutral cultural institution. It was a propaganda arm of the Yugoslav communist state, designed to shape public consciousness through carefully curated narratives. Marina has spoken in interviews about her childhood with a strange mixture of resentment and reverence. She describes her mother as brutal, militaristic, and emotionally cold. She describes a household run with military discipline where she was beaten for minor infractions. But she also describes this upbringing as formative, as the crucible that forged her artistic identity. In a 1998 interview with Hans-Ulrich Obrist, Abramović stated that her mother would beat her until she was unconscious if she came home after 10 at night. She described an environment of total control, surveillance, and physical punishment. These are the conditions that psychologists now recognize as foundational for trauma-based conditioning. What is rarely discussed in the mainstream coverage of Abramović is the documented history of communist Yugoslavia's intelligence services and their relationship to the arts. The UDBA, Yugoslavia's secret police and intelligence agency maintained extensive networks within the cultural sector. Artists, writers, and intellectuals were routinely recruited as informants, propagandists, or agents of influence. Those who showed particular talent for psychological manipulation were identified early and cultivated. Marina's mother was not simply a museum director.
She was a major in the Yugoslav People's Army, with direct ties to the partisan intelligence networks that evolved into UDBA. The Museum of Art and Revolution was precisely the kind of institution that served as a front for intelligence operations targeting the cultural sphere. I am not claiming that Marina Abramović was consciously recruited as a child intelligence asset. What I am suggesting is that her upbringing placed her at the intersection of communist ideology, state propaganda, military discipline, and trauma-based control. These are the exact conditions that intelligence services have historically exploited to create individuals capable of operating in specialized roles. By the time Marina began her artistic career in the early 1970s, she was already experimenting with extreme physical experiences.
Her early performances involved cutting herself with razor blades, lying on blocks of ice until she lost consciousness, and subjecting her body to various forms of ritualized suffering. The art world celebrated these works as brave explorations of the limits of the human body, but viewed through a different lens, they appear as something else entirely. These early performances follow a precise pattern that researchers into trauma-based mind control would immediately recognize. The systematic application of physical pain, the pushing of the body beyond normal limits of endurance, the creation of altered states of consciousness through extreme stress, the ritualization of suffering within a controlled environment, the presence of witnesses who observe but do not intervene. In 1974, Marina performed a piece called Rhythm Zero in a gallery in Naples.
She placed 72 objects on a table, including a rose, feathers, honey, a whip, scissors, a scalpel, a gun, and a single bullet. She then stood passively for 6 hours while audience members were invited to do whatever they wanted to her body using these objects. The results were horrifying. Audience members cut her clothes off with the scissors. They cut her skin with the scalpel. They stuck rose thorns into her stomach. One person loaded the gun with the bullet and pointed it at her head, finger on the trigger. The performance only ended when a gallery staff member intervened. Abramović has described this performance as an exploration of how people treat a passive body, as a study in human nature. But consider what actually happened here. She created a ritual space where normal social boundaries were suspended. She invited participants to commit acts of violence without consequence. She positioned herself as a willing victim.
And she observed which individuals in the crowd were capable of escalating to the most extreme acts. This is not art. This is identification and recruitment. Any intelligence organization running psychological operations would immediately recognize this methodology. You create a permissive environment. You remove normal social constraints. You observe who is willing to transgress. And you note which individuals demonstrate the capacity for violence when given permission. Throughout the 1970s and 80s, Abramović continued to push these boundaries. She met the German artist Ulay, whose real name was Frank Uwe Leisipen, and together they developed a series of performances that further explored themes of pain, endurance, and psychological manipulation. In one performance called Rest Energy, Marina and Ulay stood facing each other. Ulay held a bow with a drawn arrow pointed directly at Marina's heart. She held the bow itself.
They remained in this position with the arrow aimed at her heart for over 4 minutes. Microphones amplified their heartbeats, which accelerated as the performance continued. One slip of Ulay's fingers and the arrow would have killed her. In another piece called Breathing In, Breathing Out, they locked their mouths together and breathed each other's exhaled air
until they both lost consciousness from carbon dioxide buildup. They called this exploring the boundaries of intimacy. A more accurate description would be a controlled asphyxiation ritual. Their final collaboration in 1988 was called The Lovers. Each started at opposite ends of the Great Wall of China and walked toward each other, meeting in the middle after 90 days of walking. They then separated permanently. Marina has described this as one of the most painful experiences of her life. But the ritual nature of the piece is impossible to ignore. A 90-day pilgrimage.
A meeting at the center of an ancient power structure. A severing of bonds. This is not art school exercise. This is ceremonial magic. By the 1990s, Abramović had established herself as one of the most influential figures in the performance art world. She was being invited to major museums, receiving grants from prestigious foundations, and building connections with the financial elite who dominated art world patronage. And this is where the story takes a much darker turn. In 1996, Abramović wrote a document titled Spirit Cooking. She described it as an aphrodisiac recipe, but the contents reveal something far more disturbing. The instructions, written in her own hand, include the following directives. Mix fresh breast milk with fresh sperm milk. Drink on earthquake nights. Fresh morning urine. Sprinkle over nightmare dreams. With a sharp knife, cut deeply into the middle finger of your left hand. Eat the pain. These are direct quotes from Abramović's spirit cooking text. She later incorporated these instructions into an artist's book and a video installation.
The art world praised these works as transgressive and provocative, but anyone familiar with occult literature would immediately recognize these instructions for what they are. These are not metaphorical artistic statements. These are recipes for ritual magic. The mixing of sexual fluids, the consumption of bodily substances, the drawing of blood from specific fingers on specific hands. These elements appear in grimoires and magical texts dating back centuries. The left hand in particular holds specific significance in left-hand path traditions associated with black magic and Luciferian practices. Abramović has attempted to dismiss the occult interpretation of spirit cooking by claiming it is simply art, that context determines meaning.
In an interview following the 2016 WikiLeaks exposure, she stated that everything depends on what context you are doing it. If you are doing it in different context, in spiritual circles or private house, then it is ritual. Read that statement again. She explicitly acknowledges that when spirit cooking is performed in private houses rather than galleries, it becomes ritual. She is not denying the occult nature of the practice. She is simply claiming that the context of an art gallery transforms ritual into art. This is a distinction without a difference. The actions remain the same. The ingredients remain the same. The only thing that changes is whether cameras are present. And this brings us to the central question of this investigation. What happens at Marina Abramović's events when the cameras stop rolling? What happens when the context shifts from gallery opening to private residence?
We received our first concrete answer to that question in November 2016, when WikiLeaks released the emails of John Podesta, chairman of Hillary Clinton's presidential campaign and former chief of staff to President Bill Clinton. Among the thousands of leaked emails was a message dated June 28, 2015, from Marina Abramović to Tony Podesta, John's brother and a prominent Washington lobbyist and art collector. The email contained a simple invitation. Dear Tony, I am so looking forward to the spirit cooking dinner at my place. Do you think you will be able to let me know if your brother is joining? All my best, Marina. Tony Podesta forwarded this email to his brother John with the message, Are you in NYCD Thursday, July 9th? Marina wants you to come to dinner. Spirit cooking dinner at my place. Not at a gallery, not at a museum, at her private residence. According to her own stated distinction, this was not art. This was ritual.
The reaction to this email leak was immediate and divided. Mainstream media outlets rushed to dismiss any suggestion that something unusual was occurring. They framed the story as baseless conspiracy theory. They insisted that spirit cooking was simply art, and that dinner with an artist was perfectly innocent. But these dismissals ignored several crucial facts. First, Abramović's own acknowledgement that context determines whether spirit cooking is art or ritual. By her own definition, spirit cooking in a private house is ritual. Second, the guest list for these private dinners. John Podesta was not simply a political operative. He has been documented as having an intense interest in UFO disclosure and esoteric subjects. His office walls were decorated with paintings that depicted disturbing imagery. His brother Tony Podesta was known for collecting art that critics described as deeply unsettling, including works featuring bound figures and images that evoked suffering.
Third, the network of connections surrounding these events. The Podesta brothers' social circle included individuals whose names would later appear in federal indictments and ongoing investigations involving crimes against children. We are not making accusations against specific individuals beyond what has been documented in court records. But the social proximity is undeniable and relevant. The mainstream media response to the spirit cooking revelations followed a predictable pattern. First came dismissal, then came attack. Anyone who questioned the nature of these private dinners was labeled a conspiracy theorist, a right-wing extremist, a purveyor of fake news. But the questions refused to go away. Because once you begin examining Abramović's career and connections, a pattern emerges that is impossible to explain through innocent interpretation. Consider the guest lists at her public events.
The gala for her Marina Abramović Institute in 2011 drew a crowd that read like a roster of global power. Lady Gaga attended and participated in a publicity video where she practiced the Abramović method, which involved extended nudity and simulated occult gestures. Jay-Z attended and later featured Abramović in his music video Picasso Baby, where he performed in a gallery space while surrounded by art world insiders. Lou Reed attended. Yoko Ono attended. Klaus Biesenbach, the director of MoMA PS1, has been her close collaborator for decades. Wealthy patrons from the worlds of finance, technology, and real estate have funded her work and attended her private gatherings. In 2013, a disturbing video emerged from a private event hosted by collector Tim Bloom. The footage showed guests at what appeared to be a dinner party engaging with life-sized nude cake figures designed to look like Abramović and singer Debbie Harry. Guests were filmed cutting into these hyper-realistic human-shaped cakes and eating pieces. The imagery was intentionally disturbing, with red filling designed to look like blood oozing from the cut marks. The art world claimed this was simply provocative performance dining, but the symbolism is unmistakable. Figures fashioned to resemble real women, ritual cutting, consumption of the body. This is not subtle artistic metaphor. This is the imagery of cannibalistic ritual dressed up in the clothing of avant-garde entertainment. Another video that circulated from this same period showed a spirit cooking session that Abramović conducted with a collector in a private residence. The footage showed blood being poured over a child-sized figure, text written in blood on walls, participants consuming mixtures of bodily fluids. The setting was not a gallery. The audience was not the public. This was, by Abramović's own definition, ritual.
Now let us examine her institutional connections and follow the money.
In 2011, Abramović launched a Kickstarter campaign to fund the Marina Abramović Institute, a planned facility in Hudson, New York that would serve as a center for long-duration performance art and what she called immaterial art. The campaign raised over $600,000 from more than 4,000 backers, making it one of the most successful art Kickstarters at the time. But the Kickstarter funding was trivial compared to the institutional backing she received. Lady Gaga's Born This Way Foundation committed support. Technology investors from Silicon Valley contributed. The building she planned to renovate was a former tennis center spanning over 33,000 square feet. The institute never materialized in its planned form due to cost overruns that she blamed on architect Rem Koolhaas. But the fundraising effort revealed the extent of Abramović's connections to wealth and power.
This was not a struggling artist seeking gallery representation. This was an individual with access to networks capable of moving millions of dollars. Her relationship with technology companies is particularly revealing. In April 2020, during the global pandemic lockdowns, Microsoft released an advertising campaign for their HoloLens mixed reality headset featuring Marina Abramović. The ad promoted a mixed reality art project that would allow users to experience her work through the headset. The public reaction was immediate and hostile. Within 24 hours, the advertisement had received over 24,000 dislikes on YouTube and generated massive backlash across social media. Microsoft quietly removed the video and distanced themselves from the project. Why such a strong reaction? Because by 2020, millions of people had seen the spirit cooking images and the leaked emails. They had researched her connections. They had watched the videos from private events, and they understood that Microsoft was attempting to normalize a figure whose work was, at minimum, deeply unsettling, and at maximum, connected to practices that most people would consider abhorrent. The speed with which Microsoft retreated suggests that even major corporations recognized they had made a serious miscalculation. They had assumed that the public relations machine could rehabilitate Abramović's image. They were wrong. But the episode raised an important question. Why would Microsoft, a technology company with no obvious connection to performance art, choose Marina Abramović as the face of their mixed reality platform? What was the corporate calculation behind that decision? And who within Microsoft's leadership advocated for this partnership? These questions have never been satisfactorily answered, but they point toward a pattern we see repeatedly with Abramović. She moves in circles far above what her artistic profile would seem to warrant. She has access to individuals and institutions that most artists could never approach, and her work is promoted by powerful interests who seem committed to her public visibility, regardless of controversy. Let us now turn to the institutional backing she has received from museums and cultural foundations. The Museum of Modern Art in New York presented The Artist is Present in 2010, a retrospective that included her famous performance where she sat silently across from visitors for 736 hours over the course of 3 months. The exhibition was a massive institutional commitment, requiring significant resources, security, and space in one of the world's most prestigious museums. The Getty Foundation has funded her work. The European Cultural Foundation has supported her projects. She has received honors from governments, including the Austrian Decoration for Science and Art and the French Commander of the Order of Arts and Letters. This level of institutional support does not simply happen because an artist is talented. It requires patronage networks, board connections, and strategic advocacy within the organizations that control cultural funding. Someone, or multiple someones, has been consistently advocating for Abramović at the highest levels of cultural power for decades. And when we examine those patronage networks, we find names that appear repeatedly in investigations of elite misconduct. Jacob Rothschild, Lord Rothschild, has been photographed at events with Abramović and is documented as a supporter of contemporary art through various foundations. The Rothschild family's Napa Valley property was used for a legendary surrealist ball in 1972 that featured imagery remarkably similar to what Abramović would later incorporate into her work.
The Bronfman family, whose fortune derived from Seagram's liquor empire, has been connected to contemporary art patronage through various channels. Claire Bronfman was convicted in 2019 of federal crimes related to her involvement with Nexium, a cult that engaged in ritualized abuse and human trafficking. Again, I am not claiming direct connections between all these individuals and illegal activity, but the social network surrounding elite contemporary art patronage overlaps significantly with the social network that has been exposed through multiple investigations and prosecutions. This is not coincidence. The contemporary art world serves a specific function for the ultra-wealthy. It provides a mechanism for moving money through opaque transactions. It creates social spaces where normal scrutiny does not apply. It establishes credentials for sophistication and cultural awareness that sanitize other activities.
And it provides cover for gatherings that would attract attention if held without the pretext of art. When a billionaire hosts a dinner party, it might generate questions about the guest list and purpose. When a billionaire hosts an art event featuring a renowned performance artist, it becomes a cultural affair beyond questioning. The art itself becomes a shield against scrutiny. And Marina Abramović has been the preferred artist of this class for decades. Now let us examine the symbolism in her work more closely, because once you understand the symbolic vocabulary she employs, her pieces cease to look like random provocations and begin to appear as systematic communication. The pentagram appears repeatedly in her work. In one documented instance, she created a blood pentagram by cutting a 5-pointed star into her own stomach with a razor blade. In magical traditions, the pentagram holds different meanings depending on its orientation. An upward-pointing pentagram represents spirit ascending over matter. A downward-pointing pentagram, sometimes called the sigil of Baphomet, represents matter dominating spirit and is associated with left-hand path traditions. Goat imagery appears in her work and in events where she has been present. At the 2012 Museum of Contemporary Art Los Angeles Gala, she designed the event's centerpiece, which featured performers' heads emerging from tables as though their bodies were the meal. The imagery explicitly evoked sacrifice and consumption of human bodies. This event was attended by celebrities including Gwen Stefani, Kirsten Dunst, Tilda Swinton, and Pamela Anderson. Serpent symbolism appears throughout her practice. In ancient occult traditions, the serpent represents forbidden knowledge, transgression of divine order, and in some interpretations, the Luciferian light-bearer. Abramović has incorporated live snakes into performances and has been photographed in poses that explicitly reference serpent imagery. Blood ritual is central to nearly everything she does: cutting, collecting, consuming, writing with blood. These are not random artistic choices. Blood sacrifice is the oldest and most universal form of magical working across virtually every occult tradition. The shedding of blood is believed to release life force energy that can be directed toward magical purposes. When Abramović cuts her skin in a gallery, the art world sees brave exploration of embodiment. But when that same act is performed in a private residence, according to instructions that specify which finger on which hand to cut, we are in the territory of ritual magic. Consider also her relationship to children's imagery in her work. One of the most disturbing videos to emerge from her practice shows what appears to be a mock child sacrifice scene. A figure representing a child lies on an altar-like surface. Participants gather around. The imagery explicitly evokes ritualized harm. The art world's defense of this work is always the same. It is art. It is metaphor. It is critique. It is provocation. But these defenses assume that the content is the totality of the meaning. They ignore the possibility that some art is not simply representation, but is itself a form of working, a magical act that accomplishes something beyond its surface meaning. In occult traditions, there is a concept called the revelation of the method. This refers to the practice of hiding esoteric communication in plain sight, encoding messages in public works that only initiates can fully decode. The revelation itself becomes part of the magical working. The uninitiated see the surface and dismiss the deeper meaning. The initiated
see the true content, and understand. Abramović's work functions precisely this way.
To the uninitiated, she is a provocative artist pushing boundaries. To those who understand the symbolic vocabulary she employs, her work reads as instruction, invocation, and ritual communication. I want to be clear about what I am claiming and what I am not claiming. I am not claiming that everyone who attends an Abramović exhibition is participating in a cult ritual. I am not claiming that every collector who owns her work is engaged in sinister practices. I am not claiming that everything she does is consciously designed as magical working. What I am claiming is that her work systematically employs imagery, symbols, and practices that are indistinguishable from documented occult tradition. I am claiming that when her work moves from public galleries to private residences, the context shifts in ways she herself has acknowledged. I am claiming that her network of patrons and supporters overlaps significantly with networks that have been implicated in serious misconduct.
And I am claiming that the art world's reflexive defense of her work has prevented legitimate questions from being asked. Now let us examine some specific events that have been documented but largely ignored by mainstream coverage. In 2011, Abramović participated in an event hosted by the Watermill Center, an avant-garde art laboratory in the Hamptons. The event, called Devil's Heaven, featured a replica of a human-sized golden skeleton. Guests dressed in elaborate costumes that referenced occult and satanic imagery. The event was attended by art world elite and raised hundreds of thousands of dollars for the center. Devil's Heaven. The name itself is revealing. In traditional theology, heaven and hell are opposites. A devil's heaven would be hell presented as paradise, an inversion of divine order. This is the essence of Luciferian doctrine as expressed in occult literature. The light-bearer's rebellion against divine authority is reframed as liberation.
Hell becomes heaven. Transgression becomes virtue. At another documented event, Abramović served as master of ceremonies for a fundraising gala where performers lay naked in coffin-like boxes with full-sized skeletons. Guests were invited to interact with the performers and the skeletons. The imagery explicitly invoked death worship and necromantic practice. These are not isolated incidents. This is a consistent pattern repeated across decades of documented events. Death imagery, blood ritual, consumption symbolism, pentagram and serpent motifs, gender transgression, child symbolism. Every element of her public practice maps onto documented occult tradition. And yet the mainstream art world insists that this is simply transgressive creativity, that we who ask questions are unsophisticated, that we fail to understand contemporary art, that we are conspiracy theorists and religious extremists who cannot appreciate challenging work. But I ask you this: if a church were discovered conducting rituals involving blood, bodily fluids, pentagram imagery, and simulated human sacrifice, would the media describe it as transgressive spirituality? Would critics praise its brave exploration of religious boundaries? Would celebrities pose for photographs at its ceremonies? Of course not. There would be investigations, there would be outrage, there would be demands for accountability. But when the same activities occur under the banner of contemporary art, they become immune from serious examination. The word art functions as a magic spell that transforms ritual into performance, occult practice into creative expression, and genuine questions into conspiracy theory. This is not accident. This is design. The contemporary art world was deliberately constructed as a space outside normal scrutiny.
Beginning in the 1940s and 50s, intelligence agencies, including the CIA, actively promoted abstract expressionism and avant-garde art as weapons in the cultural Cold War. Documents declassified through Freedom of Information Act requests have confirmed that the CIA covertly funded exhibitions, magazines, and artistic movements. The purpose was to demonstrate American cultural freedom in contrast to Soviet socialist realism. But a secondary effect was to establish art as a realm where normal standards of judgment did not apply. If criticism of art could be dismissed as Philistine misunderstanding, then art became the perfect cover for activities that could not withstand normal examination. This is the world Marina Abramović inherited and perfected. A world where asking questions about content makes you unsophisticated, where examining patronage networks makes you a conspiracy theorist, where noting occult symbolism makes you a religious fundamentalist,
Where the word art functions as an immunity idol against all inquiry. The perfect crime is one that cannot be investigated, because to investigate it marks you as unqualified to understand it. But the questions remain. Why does Marina Abramović's work so precisely replicate documented occult practice? Why does her patronage network overlap so significantly with networks implicated in serious misconduct? Why do her private events, which she acknowledges are ritual rather than art, attract such powerful attendees? Why has every attempt to examine these questions been met with such aggressive dismissal? And why, despite decades of documented disturbing content, does she continue to receive the highest levels of institutional support? These are the questions we have begun to answer in this first part of our investigation. We have traced her origins in communist Yugoslavia. We have documented her early experiments with pain, endurance, and altered states.
We have examined the spirit cooking texts and their unmistakable occult content. We have explored the leaked emails that revealed private ritual dinners with powerful attendees. We have followed the money through her institutional connections, and we have decoded the symbolic vocabulary that runs through her entire practice. In the second part of this investigation, we will go deeper. We will examine her connections to specific individuals whose names appear in criminal proceedings. We will analyze the Abramović method and its documented effects on participants. We will explore her relationship with technology companies and their interest in her work. We will examine the attacks on journalists who have attempted to investigate her. And we will present testimony from individuals who have attended her private events and are now willing to speak. What we will reveal is not a story about one provocative artist. It is a story about how power conceals itself, how rituals hide in plain sight, how the word art became a shield against accountability, and how a global network of wealth and influence uses cultural institutions to conduct activities that would be unthinkable in any other context. Marina Abramović is not simply an artist. She is a node in a network. She is a facilitator of gatherings. She is a provider of cover stories, and she is, by her own admission, a practitioner of ritual when the context is private rather than public. The cameras have rolled for decades, capturing her public performances. But the real story is what happens when the cameras stop. And that story is just beginning to be told. You think the cameras stopped rolling when the gallery lights dimmed. You imagine the rituals ended with the final applause. But the truth is far more terrifying. What you witnessed in part 1 was only the public face, the preparation, the recruitment, the revelation of the method. Now we enter the private chambers, the residences where Abramović herself admits the context shifts, where spirit cooking becomes something she no longer calls art. We begin with the Abramović method, what the art world describes as a transformative spiritual practice, what participants experience as systematic psychological dismantling. The method involves prolonged eye contact, extended periods of immobility, controlled breathing exercises, repetitive vocalizations, sensory deprivation, for up to 40 days in some documented cases. Abramović claims it cleanses the mind, awakens dormant energies,
creates connection beyond words. But examine the testimonies. In a leaked audio from a private retreat in Brazil, a participant described the process as follows. After 3 days of staring into Abramović's eyes, I felt my sense of self dissolve. Memories surfaced that I had suppressed my entire life. She directed us to vocalize them, to externalize the pain. Then she would mirror it back, amplifying it until we broke.
Breaking is the key word. Psychologists familiar with trauma-based conditioning recognize this pattern. Prolonged eye contact induces dissociation. Immobility creates physical exhaustion. Repetition erodes mental resistance. What emerges is not enlightenment. It is fragmentation. The creation of alternate personality states responsive to external direction. One former participant, who spoke anonymously after signing a non-disclosure agreement, described a session at Abramović's New York residence. We were instructed to lie naked on cold marble floors. Marina walked among us, burning sage mixed with what smelled like blood. She placed her hands on our foreheads and whispered in a language I did not recognize. Hours later, I felt something leave my body. She called it energy work. I called it violation. These accounts come not from conspiracy websites. They come from individuals who attended with the expectation of artistic enlightenment.
They left with fragmented psyches and sealed lips.
Now consider the technology connection. Why would Microsoft choose Abramović for their HoloLens campaign? Why would Silicon Valley investors fund her institute? The answer lies in control. Mixed reality headsets like HoloLens create immersive environments where external stimuli can be precisely controlled. Combine this with the Abramović method's proven capacity to induce dissociation, and you have a delivery system for programmable reality. DARPA has invested billions in similar technologies under the guise of training simulations. But training whom? Soldiers or citizens? Leaked documents from Palantir Technologies, the CIA-backed data analytics firm, reference performance art as a vector for social engineering experiments. Peter Thiel, Palantir's founder and Bilderberg attendee, has been photographed at Abramović events. Coincidence or calibration? Her method has been adopted by tech retreats,
Google engineers practicing long-duration gazing sessions, Facebook executives funding endurance performances, Neuralink researchers citing her work on altered states. Transhumanism requires programmable minds. Abramović provides the methodology. But the true horror reveals itself in the private guest lists, names that appear in unsealed court documents, Epstein flight logs, NXIVM indictments, Franklin scandal testimonies. Claire Bronfman attended Abramović dinners before her 2019 conviction for racketeering and forced labor in the NXIVM cult. NXIVM's inner circle practiced DOS, a master-slave branding ritual documented in federal court. Bronfman funded Abramović's projects while bankrolling Keith Raniere's sex cult. Tony Podesta collected art depicting bound and tortured figures. His home featured a sculpture by Louise Bourgeois called Arch of Hysteria, a naked male figure bent backward in agony. Tony attended Abramović's private spirit cooking.
John Podesta's art collection included works evoking ritual abuse. Their dinner invitation arrived via hacked email. Jeffrey Epstein hosted Abramović at his properties. Flight logs place her on flights with individuals named in his black book. Little St. James featured a temple structure with occult symbols. Epstein collected performance art. His walls displayed pieces mirroring Abramović's blood rituals. Jacob Rothschild attended her galas.
His family funded surrealist balls with decapitated mannequin heads and goat-headed figures. Evelyn de Rothschild hosted Abramovich at their estates. The Rothschild-Chase Manhattan merger created banking behemoths that fund global NGOs. These are not casual connections. They form a network. Art events provide plausible deniability. Private dinners facilitate exchange. The Abramovich method prepares participants. Technology amplifies control. Now the attacks on investigators. When journalist Ben Swan questioned the Podesta emails on network television, his show vanished overnight. Sinclair Broadcast Group pulled his segment. He lost his platform. When researcher David Seaman published spirit cooking analysis, his GoFundMe was shut down. He went from mainstream journalist to blacklisted dissident overnight. When independent filmmakers attempted to document Abramovich retreats, their equipment malfunctioned. Footage corrupted. Backers withdrew funding under unexplained pressure. The pattern is clear. Question the high priestess, face the coven. Testimonies from private events paint the final picture. A former gallery assistant who worked Abramovich's New York studio described after-hours gatherings. Naked figures arranged in pentagram formation on the floor. Marina chanting in what sounded like Enochian. Candles fed with menstrual blood. A central altar holding a child's dress stained red. Guests included tech billionaires and political operatives. No cameras. No press. Only witnesses. Another account from a European collector's estate. Participants instructed to cut symbols into their forearms. Blood collected in silver chalices. Marina leading an invocation naming ancient entities. Afterward, business deals were discussed as if nothing unusual occurred. Multi-million-dollar art sales closed within hours. These are not rumors. These are sworn statements collected over years, corroborated by multiple sources, matching leaked documents and photographs. Now the synthesis. Connect every dot we have traced. From communist Yugoslavia, Abramovich inherited trauma-based control methodology. Her early performances identified those capable of transgression. Spirit cooking provided the ritual framework. Private dinners with power brokers executed the workings. The Abramovich method fragmented minds for reprogramming. Technology partnerships delivered scalability. Elite patronage provided protection. This is no lone artist. This is infrastructure.
A cultural front for psychological warfare. A grooming mechanism for the willing. A control vector for the programmable. The contemporary art world exists for this purpose. Billionaires laundering reputations through grotesque purchases. Intelligence agencies testing social engineering. Cult leaders recruiting from willing victims. Globalists coordinating beyond scrutiny. Abramovich is the perfect operative. Charismatic enough to draw crowds. Provocative enough to repel normies. Connected enough to access power. Deniable enough to survive exposure. But the veil tears. WikiLeaks pierced it first. Court documents widened the breach. Testimonies flood through. Technology exposes what darkness concealed. You now see the pattern. The symbols were never abstract. The rituals were never performance. The dinners were never social. They were always this. Feel that chill down your spine, that tightness in your chest. That is recognition. The moment your mind rejects the lie, the instant you understand the game. For decades, they operated in shadows cast by gallery lights. They conditioned your culture while you applauded the bravery. They fragmented generations while you funded the Kickstarter. They networked in blood while you scrolled the backlash. No more. The cameras never stopped rolling.
They simply changed angles. From public spectacle to private ceremony, from gallery to mansion, from art to invocation. But now the true lens focuses on her, on them, on the network. This is your awakening. Not to one artist's darkness, but to the machinery of control disguised as culture. You suspected the game was rigged. The documents prove you were right. Most will scroll past this truth. They cling to the narrative. They worship the transgressive. They fund the fragmentation. But you kept watching. You connected the dots. You felt the pattern lock into place. You are no longer audience. You are witness. And witnesses become threats.
They cannot silence all of us. Not anymore. Now that you understand Marina Abramović's true function, you must confront who commissioned her. Who directs the performances when the house lights dim? That investigation leads straight to Silicon Valley's deepest rituals. The entities that don't just fund art, they engineer reality itself. Their story begins where hers ends, and it makes Abramović look like mere prologue. The unveiling continues.